Hello, Sophie. Many thanks that you are ready to present here on our housing symposium
Good
in
afternoon.
Lima. Good afternoon. May I make a very short introduction, and then I propose that you can introduce yourself and your projects. Very short. This is a community aspects related directly to housing. It's about intergenerational housing, and also to further develop these ideas into the future. The relation to Love Needs presentation is that the home uh, is not just a place where I can stay, but where I can live in human dignity. Sophie, if you would be ready to make an introduction and to make your presentation, please.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And Ulrich, thank you for the invitation to speak with you. I did try and attend in person, but the flight times weren't going to work for me. So I'm sorry I have to join online, but hopefully you can hear everything I say and everything will be good. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is I'm going to build on our long-standing body of research as to how urban places can meet the needs of different generations of residents who live in them. So the research that we've been doing and stakeholder engagement work, what we're trying to do is to make sure that in the UK context, we're planning for and building communities that are going to be working for the next 5, 10, 20 plus years, but that have intergenerational futures at their heart. So I'm Professor Sophie Hadfield-Hill, and all of this work that I'm going to talk about today is with Professor Peter Craftle, and we're both at the University of Birmingham. Just a little bit about us both to see where this sits in context. So my background is children's geography. I like the previous presentation, a lot of emphasis on childhood. So my research spans young people's lives in the UK, but also I've done research in India and also Brazil with a focus on young people's experiences of urban change. I was the previous chair of the RGS IBG Geographies of Children, Young People and Families Research Group, and I'm also an editor of Children's Geography Journal. And I've just put some keywords on the slide there on the right, which just shows some of the areas that I've written to. So about young people's mobilities, about politics and inequality, diverse childhoods, and as I said, our main focus is urban change. So young people that are living in areas of urban transformation. Then Peter, also a professor of human geography, so his work focuses on young people's interactions with environmental processes, and his approach is very much a new materialist and not a post-human approach. He's been making contributions to the work of geographies of education, alternative education, and materiality. But what we've been doing together over the past 10 years really is our focus on new urban places and how we can support developers and planners and local authorities in designing and implementing new build communities that are going to work for everyone. We often say that if we get it right for children, often a community will work for everybody, and hopefully that will become clear as I speak. In terms of the methods that we use across all of our research projects, so we use, you can read on the slide the methods that we use to understand young people's mobilities, their citizenship, and their participation in their communities. Much of what we do is grounded in ethnography, so we spend time in the places and the communities that we do our work in. In the UK, Brazil, and India, we've spent months and sometimes a whole year living in and interacting with the children and families that take part in our research. We do use traditional qualitative methods, including peer and family and individual interviews, as well as workshops, community engagement activities. Sometimes we ask young people to do drawings, And we often find guided walks around communities give a real sense of place, and sometimes the tensions in those places become more apparent when you're walking through them. Over the years, we've also used GPS trackers as well as mobile apps and devices which track mobility to look at young people's and their families' interactions with different spaces. Really interested in are people using the spaces which have been designed for them by planners, architects, urban designers, and how are they moving about and through those spaces? So where does this kind of background bring us to today then? So whilst much of our work over the past 10 years has focused on young people's experiences, our most recent project has a more intergenerational lens on community building. Many of you might know that large-scale house building is on the political agenda here in the UK. And from our discussions with residents and key stakeholders, this focus on intergenerational futures is needed to learn from communities which have been built in the past 20 or so years, those that are being built now, but also those in the pipeline, and how can we influence kind of what's coming through, as I said, in the next 5, 10, 15 years. There was a photograph on the first slide of a report that we published last year, and you can, I'll show this again at the end, and you can download this from the internet. But we ran a stakeholder workshop which contributed to the kind of recommendations of that report. And as a group of professionals from government bodies to local authorities and architects and planners, we kind of identified three core things. So firstly, there's both an evidence but also a practice gap around our understanding of intergenerational relations, how we can make our communities more inclusive, and what infrastructures we will need to provide for diverse groups and different housing types. Secondly, there's a need for a new approach to community and house building, which goes beyond the home. We need to think much more strategically about our streets, our public spaces, and those community assets that really make a place livable. Then thirdly, we need to be more explicit about how care and the longer term stewardship of place are both experienced and planned into community building. So when a place is finished, when the developer moves on, when the builders move, people move in, what happens to it in terms of the ongoing stewardship? Who's responsible, and how do these things work in practice? So in all of our work, this is our aim then, to ensure that we are building and planning with intergenerational futures at their heart. So in designing this project, we wanted to kind of prompt an even longer term visioning of what we want our communities to be like in the future. And off the back of COVID, what should our communities look like when we're supporting our communities through crisis, whether that be economic crisis, health, or otherwise? So this pilot project that we did was 20 interviews with quite key professional stakeholders in the UK who were representatives of national bodies, local authorities, and commercial companies who were responsible for the planning, design, and delivery of new urban places. And we also included in this some interviews of residents of new build communities who have just moved in. So these were the themes that came out of our this pilot project, and I'm going to speak to those highlighted in blue. So the short-termism in making these places, the planning decisions that are involved, how important it is to have a mix of ages on site. A really key point was the flexibility that needs to be involved in terms of thinking about intergenerational relations. And then some points about COVID and how we could plan better for intergenerational spaces. So first then, interviewees were particularly keen on telling us about the short-termism of new urban places. And this really had implications for both planning for intergenerational futures, but also planning for crisis. A short-term approach can really have multiple impacts on people and place. And things that came up in our research were insufficient infrastructures, where cost-cutting impacts on the build and material quality, a lack of community support, and a very much a tick box approach when it came to issues like climate change. As one of our professional stakeholders said, they're really short term. They're just trying to get the site through. They're just thinking about that 1 year of their turnover. And of course, as we all expect, this would have an impact on lived experience. One of our residents that we spoke to was really quite vocal about the cost cutting and the build quality. Unfortunately, in the house that they moved into, the joists of the first floor of the new build house, they weren't fitted correctly. It was as if it had all been rushed and processes were missed. So not long after moving in, his family had to move out for the best part of a year for then it to be fixed and resolved. So as you can see, this short-term approach really had a long-term impact on his family. The second theme relates to planning decisions which were made about the design and the structure of place. Residents repeatedly told us that they felt that segregation had been planned into their community, particularly in terms of housing tenure, in terms of where different tenure of houses were located, the design of the roads, the spatial layout of the place. They really didn't feel that it was inclusive and that segregation had been really, unfortunately, planned in from the beginning. Second, design features to democratize the street, they said, didn't seem to be working, whether because of irresponsible parking, speeding, or the silence of electric cars, or perhaps those not understanding the rules of the new roads. This all had an impact on resident experiences. And one resident in this project commented that shared spaces in these developments is a disaster, it's dangerous. And this does actually makes me think back to work we did with children in some developments in Northamptonshire, where again, the shared surface streets, whilst a good idea in principle, the reality of young people navigating these shared surfaces with car drivers was quite problematic. And third, residents told us about the lack of facilities that they'd been promised during kind of when they were buying and during the build phase. So the delays related to the building of schools, delays to community buildings, to cafes or opportunities to play. One of our participants told us about in her community, the promise of a school hadn't materialised. So whilst, yes, the school is open, which they said there was going to be a school, what the developers and the builders didn't say was that the school was going to be starting with only reception children, so the very tiny children, and every year a new year group would be added. So this family had bought a house in this place and they had a year 3 or 4 pupil. And so in reality, their child would never be able to go to the school because the year group for her child wouldn't be ready. So on buying the house, this wasn't explained. So really kind of more communication around how these places are working in practice. And then fourth, we've seen that problems arise when there's a lack of legibility in terms of open spaces. And this causes tensions between generations. Much more clarity is needed in terms of who owns particular spaces and what they're for. And particularly with children and young people who are using their communities in different ways, the kind of tension over space and public and private and whose it is does cause quite a few community tensions. Third is about the mix of ages on site. So we know from previous research that planning places that work for children and young people can make sense in several ways. In terms of financially, in terms of building a place where people want to live, enabling physical activity across generations, not excluding these people in terms of design and maintenance, because quite often they're the ones who are the most frequent users of these spaces. And residents and stakeholders both spoke about the importance of a mix of ages on site, with older generations also playing an instrumental role in building community and supporting the younger generations. Then a key theme which came up was about flexible spaces. So amongst both the professionals and the residents, there was this call for further flexibility to be built into new housing developments, particularly in terms of enabling residents to age in place and to live well with one another across generations. Stakeholders and residents alike spoke of different examples of house building designs that would enable different generations of the same family to live together, which would create a dynamic, flexible space that could be reorganized as needs evolved, and which could be kind of prioritizing at different times of your life. One stakeholder in particular in the quote highlights an example in London with flexible flats, where walls could be moved to divide it, which could be changed according to changing needs. He says you could move the walls around, you could take the whole floor up, essentially divide it up how you wanted to. And here it's also important to mention the need for multi-use spaces, which can enable diverse forms of recreation. These spaces are vital for fostering conviviality, health and well-being. And across the communities that we've worked in, we have some really good examples of where kind of multi-use public spaces have worked well, but also examples where they haven't worked so well, and it's purely down to the design of those spaces, and could be to do with noise, because if an area hasn't been kind of, there was one particular example where some high brick walls were built at the end of a street, and the sound in that area really kind of amplified. And so when children were playing outside, people were complaining about the noise, and there was no kind of soft infrastructure in that area to absorb some of that sound. So kind of the design of the space had really caused problems with how different generations were using it and interacting. In our project, we also included a reflection of how new communities and the impact of COVID, and there are several kind of takeaway points here. And first, it's not surprisingly that the more established settlements and that those that were built adjacent to existing communities were better equipped to deal with the impacts in terms of the physical and social infrastructures available. So where a new urban development, where it was kind of attached to somewhere pre-existing, those places had tended to deal with it better, rather than the isolated kind of standalone villages and new towns. And secondly, the density of the housing and the design, which promoted walkability, obviously was also valuable during that time. And third, the intergenerational aspects of new communities were an asset during the health crisis. This intergenerational support was vital. So in our research, there was some disagreement on how well intergenerational projects have been prioritised and executed in the UK. One of our stakeholders commented, "We need housing that suits different people of different generations, but there's not very much about how you might create a place that really suits intergenerational living. We need to make sure that all new homes and communities work for people of all ages." And the point was also raised in our workshop and across interviews that whilst intergenerational communities are important, it's also important to think about the intersectional nature of generations. As one of our stakeholders commented, what makes a healthy community it's just the greatest mix of everything. You know, ethnicity, type of work, ability, education. Affordability is now such a big problem that it's having a really big effect on the lack of ability to mix. So the intersectional nature of communities is also important. So where are we taking this next, and what else is there to think about? We want to take dig a bit deeper into the intergenerational approach through the lens of care. This would be underpinned with a feminist new materialist thinking, bringing kind of social and physical infrastructures and inequities together with non-human others. So focusing on community ecologies, geologies, histories, myths, natures, and narratives. And we want to upscale our notion of care beyond the individual caring relationships, thinking about broader articulations of care within larger scale socio-physical environments. But we're also interested in absences of care. Where is care missing from the large-scale house-building agenda? And what does a lens of care offer on planning for better communities in the next 10, 20, or 50 years? The current ambition is for a million new homes over the next 2 decades in 1,000 new communities. And looking at the current government's proposals, care is only mentioned in fairly instrumental ways in terms of health and social care services. So we want to push this to see how multiple notions of care and stewardship could be operationalized in the building of new communities. And I just wanted to end with three quotes on intergenerational spaces in new communities, particularly around that notion of care. The first was from Holly, where she speaks about the importance of connection with her neighbours, the value of identity in terms of community space, and knowing that someone would help you and that others around you would care. Second, from Judy, she was a retired lady who pre-COVID moved to a new development with her husband. With no local family of her own, she offered to collect neighbours' children to and from school. It gave her a real purpose and enjoyment. She loves to help other families locally, another way which intergenerational care manifests. And the third from Emma. Here she talks about the importance of history in shaping the new community spaces. Building carescapes takes time. Care is woven into the fabric of communities, and this is something that perhaps new developments may struggle with. So are there ways in which the planning can support the local identity and the history of the place and weave in the narrative of care and responsibility in those early days of people moving into new spaces? So Peter and I are using this research and our previous work with children and families to support the design and implementation of new developments, both in the UK and internationally. And I hope this presentation has given you some insight into the ways in which care is intersected with our research with children and youth and families, and the way in which we're taking notions of care forward in our new research on intergenerational relations and house building. And thank you very much.